Welcome to the Clear to Send podcast, a podcast about wireless engineering, where we educate you on Wi-Fi technology, talk about design tips, troubleshooting, interviews, and the tools. Here are your hosts, Roel and Francois.
Hi guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast. I'm here today with Roel. Hey Roel, how are you?
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm very good. And today we're going to talk about 6 gig, right? It's pretty hot in the news right now. And to talk about 6 gig, we have Chris Szymanski from Broadcom with us. Hi, Chris. How are you doing?
Hi, Francois. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show. We've been actually exchanging emails for a few months now, so we are pretty excited to have you on with us today. Would you mind presenting yourself for the audience, just telling us what you do on a daily basis and how you got involved with the whole 6 gigahertz thing?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So I work at Broadcom, and I'm director of product marketing and government affairs. And my primary focus is on, regulatory outbound marketing and standards work. So Wi-Fi Alliance, and Broadcom's representative to the board on the Wi-Fi Alliance, and then also work on some IEEE and Wireless Broadband Alliance matters. And one of the things that I focus on are those issues that are, oftentimes 3, 4 years, 5 years out, and or larger, big picture sort of strategic issues that are facing the Wi-Fi industry, or the division that I work within, Broadcom. I'm in the mobile connectivity group, which is Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS chips, typically for smartphones. So I've been working on regulatory things for a while. And I had a Christmas call about 3.5 years ago, and the head of the Office of Engineering of Technology in the FCC said, we've been working really hard to get the middle 5 gigahertz a spectrum for you all for Wi-Fi. We know that you need this for wider channels, but it's just not going to happen. Working with federal agencies, we're not going to be able to come up with rules that are conducive for Wi-Fi. And so an effort that the industry had been working on for years, back when AC was standardized, kind of fell dead. And that middle part of the 5 gigahertz band that we were trying to get access to sort of died on a global basis. So there was a need to find some other place to go. And that was really when, a solid amount of focus went into 6 gigahertz. Once we found out that we kind of run into a dead end and expanded access in the 5 gig band.
So when you're talking about the 5 gig bands, you're talking about the space between Uni 2 and what we uni Uni 2 extended, right? Yeah. So in the US, we use the Uni, right? And so we have Uni 2A. And Uni 2A, and then Uni 2C, and those are typically weather radars that are the incumbents in the band, and we have to protect those incumbents using DFS. But there's a middle part of that band called Uni 2B, and it's a huge swath of spectrum. I think it's like 5350 to maybe 50, 5490 or 70. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on it now, but the precise band edge. But that's prohibited for unlicensed use. And so industry was actively working on gaining access, not only in the US, but globally. There were discussions in the ITU and discussions with regulators on a national basis. And ultimately, there were governments that wanted to add in frequency hopping radars and bistatic radars and different types of radars that would be difficult to protect. And so kind of the conclusion that was reached was that you'd need dedicated listening devices on rooftops and things that would be problematic for a typical Wi-Fi user experience. And so that process sort of unwound after a considerable amount of work and study with various agencies within the U.S. government. And so the solution was 6 gigahertz, right?
That's right. So it's interesting because in a former life, I worked in a semiconductor foundry and in China, in Shanghai, and had worked on more government affairs work and not so much on the standardization piece. And one of my first meetings, and this was even before the call from the FCC, was at an IEEE meeting. And I was in this new role to start working on standards. And a bunch of us were having lunch, and we were talking about the next frontier. We were lamenting, kind of the direction things were going in Wi-Fi with the 5 gigahertz band. And this was in the summer. It was in San Diego at an IEEE meeting, and we just started brainstorming what could be done. And it was really around that lunch table that we started talking about the potential for 6 gigahertz. Where could we go where the propagation characteristics are close enough where we could reuse existing designs, right? Operators, when they're doing their planning, could you do a plug and play and add a new access point where it's close enough in a typical smartphone or laptop computer? Is there a way that you could use the same antenna structure and radio to cover the 5 gig and the 6 gig band? Are there places we could go opportunistically that would lead to these low latency and high throughput experiences? We talk about AR, VR. Where could we go? And we started working on this over 4 years ago, but really got serious. Actively working on this after we found out that we'd hit a dead end on the 5 gigahertz band.
All right. So, from our standpoint, just working as engineers in the field, we've been hearing about 6 gigahertz or the potential of being able to use Wi-Fi in the 6 gigahertz bands for a couple of years now. I think we had an original presentation at one of the WLPC from Chuck that works for HPE. Mm-hmm. And that's also involved, you probably know him, is also involved in the process.
Yes.
And from us, the whole process looks a little opaque. We don't really know how it works. What it takes to get those regulations changed. And obviously, it's not an easy thing, and a lot of people are involved in it. Would you be able to just explain how everything works? Why does it take 4 years to make it work? And maybe you can also talk about, what's the status today? Why is it in the news today?
Sure. Yeah, happy to cover it. So, first, it's very important to align the industry and the various stakeholders that, this is the frontier. This is where we want to go. This is where we want to put our efforts. Are there any major conflicts among industry players? And so partly you're aligning with your peers, but also because we're talking about Wi-Fi devices that, use unlicensed spectrum, the question is, how do we find a band? What band could we identify that we could make use of and could apply existing mitigation techniques and new mitigation techniques that would work for Wi-Fi, right, to protect the incumbents from harmful interference? Where do we locate? What do we do? And so the very first step was actually doing a systematic review of what I like to call, the midband. Everybody defines midband differently, okay? But what Broadcom did is we took a look at the unlicensed band in 2.4, and we looked all the way up to 12.7 gigahertz. And so, we asked ourselves, what is it that we're looking for? What experience? We've got 20 and 40 megahertz channels in the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz band. And I've already explained, how close can we be to those bands, to optimize radio designs, et cetera. But we also wanted to understand the art of the possible. And so we did a systematic review, both in the US and globally, to understand who the players were. So, as I had mentioned, finding out that, after many years of effort in the middle of the 5 gigahertz band, Uni 2B, that wasn't going to come to fruition, we wanted to be very thoughtful and strategic. And so we looked at what bands there were critical national security uses in the United States, or say it with NATO. how these bands were being used globally. Was there a band where it was harmonized, meaning that, even though Wi-Fi wasn't allowed in there, was it the same type of incumbents worldwide? So that if we could come up with a solution, say in the US, would it work in Europe, in Japan, in Australia? So we did a thorough review, and we were looking for a sufficient amount of spectrum that could enable 160 megahertz channels, so that we could drive more towards that single user gigabit experience, right? Because you've got fantastic hero class routers that are capable, when you look at, a tri-band radio design, that can drive, close to, 10 gigabits a second, but to a single user, you're limited by the capability of that chip in the user equipment, like the cell phone or the computer, et cetera. And so really wanted to make sure that there were a sufficient number of 160 megahertz channels so that users would have a good experience, so that manufacturers would feel comfortable that regardless of the market, New York, Chicago, Des Moines, Iowa, it doesn't matter, that if they bought a piece of equipment, they'd have a reasonable expectation of getting the type of experience they bought that equipment for. And so we were thinking, minimum of 4 to 5 channels nationwide in every geography is kind of typically how I've looked at this. And so that meant that if we're looking for 160 megahertz channel, we're looking for, minimum 700-800 megahertz up to, maybe 1200 megahertz. And so we started looking through all these bands, and some of these bands are restricted, anything except spurious emissions, very sensitive government end users. Oh, that's a national security or classified user. So if we don't know anything about that end user, how can we determine that we could coexist? And so it was going, frequency by frequency, band by band, to determine what made sense. And in the process of this review, we found the 6 gigahertz band. And the 6 gigahertz band was fantastic for so many different reasons. One, adjacent to 5 gig, and we, the propagation characteristics are close. Two, there was already a mobile designation in the World Radio Conference. So these World Radio Conferences under the ITU happen every 3 to 4 years. And it's a gaggle of, 190 plus countries getting together to set priorities, their study cycles. And it's a long, long process to get a mobile or a fixed or some other designation. Well, the 6 gigahertz band already had a mobile designation. Check. No need to go to the ITU. Next, we looked at this band, and almost uniformly, it was the same incumbents around the world. These really high power, highly directional fixed point-to-point users. And there's many of them for public safety. They're using them for high-frequency trading. They're using them for utilities or microwave backhaul. But these are all extremely focused, extremely high-powered beams, and they're above the clutter, because they're transmitting over, many miles of distance. And, this is in an area that we're trying to put Wi-Fi energy. So we're thinking this is pretty ideal, right? How many people are shooting, Wi-Fi energy up? If it's an access point that's outdoor directionally, you're going to have a sectoral antenna or an omnidirectional antenna, or, the vast majority of Wi-Fi operations are indoors. And so we found this to be very, very complementary, right? And then, so we looked at these incumbents, we looked at our radio designs, and we started thinking through what do we have to do to sort of protect these incumbents, and who are the interested parties. And there's no government end users anywhere in this band. And as you can imagine, having undergone a very long process with national security related, agencies and Department of Defense, et cetera, when we were trying to get access to the middle of the 5 gigahertz band, we weren't excited to undergo that process again. And we came to find out that the FCC had a database where they catalog every single license. And so all these people have licenses for operations, and we could learn the radio characteristics of their equipment. There was no guesswork. We could understand how those systems operated. We could understand how our systems would operate and interact, and we could develop mitigation strategies. So it was really having access to that information and having a lot of the regulatory hurdles that you might have to cross. We didn't have to because there was already a designation. And then the final thing was that there was already a Part 15 designation. And I know that's going to sound weird, Part 15, but that's the part of the code of the federal regulations that authorize unlicensed use in the U.S. And there was this designation that allows unlicensed devices because ultra-wideband has a special set of rules in the 6 gigahertz band. So these are different types of rules, but there were already rules in place for very low power devices. And so this just seemed like the perfect opportunity to expand. But a considerable amount of diligence, both in the US and in other countries, was required to get to the point where we could align other industry partners to do real research. And so that's why you had a period of a year and a half before we even started doing studies and went public with the FCC. So I'll pause there and see if you have any questions before I get to the formal process. But
I had 2 questions. First is, you say we, so would you be able to explain who is behind the we? Like, is it a different type of companies or, different type of people behind, the whole process? The second question I had is how much of this process, the one you just explained, how much of it is just focused on the US versus focused on, versus being an international work with the other countries?
Sure. So when I say we, I'm talking about major parties within the overall value chain, right? So, chip makers, Broadcom, Intel, Marvell, Qualcomm, MediaTek has been involved some, operating system vendors. So Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, major access point vendors like Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and Cisco and Ruckus, now a division under CommScope. So we collectively, Wi-Fi industry and interests, people that both make equipment and then use it to build applications. We approach this a little bit differently because we were thinking about, once again, what is needed to provision a service? What are we looking to do? So rather than, a bunch of chip makers making products and then saying, hey, access point vendors or OEMs making cell phones, we've got this fantastic product, take it, you can do this. It was kind of collaborative. It was a lot of research and working together to determine sort of, best fit. So we've been collectively working on this, in various organizations. And oftentimes you can look in the FCC database and you can see that many of us are filing comments and engaging in research reports, but have been working on it collectively over 3 years together. And then with respect to your geographies that you were asking, oftentimes it takes a little bit more time and a little heavier lift to get that boulder to the top of the hill. And in my experience, while every country is unique, typically you'll have various types of regulations. Some that are more directional. They tend to be higher level and not as prescriptive. And so, a lot like how the FCC regulates. And then something that is far more prescriptive. And so the European process, where you have this supra regulatory body that's called CEPT. That's the acronym. It's the Electronic Communications Committee under the CEPT, and it's a group of 48 countries. So it's basically EU adherents, some of the Baltics, former Soviet Union, but Greater Europe. They get together and they conduct studies. And the CEPT is actually a subgroup under the ITU Region 1. It's the European subgroup. So they get together and do technical analyses and oftentimes they'll do studies on behalf of the European Union. So the European Union understood that there was a deficit of spectrum for Wi-Fi. They understood it. And the European Commission, issued a mandate to the CEPT, this group. And they said, we need you to study whether or not 6 gigahertz can become available for Wi-Fi. We need more spectrum for Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is how people experience the internet wirelessly. And, you read the Cisco VNI report and you see that the Wi-Fi growth and internet traffic is all up and to the right. It's been, and it's going to be that way for this foreseeable future. And there hasn't been any new spectrum designations for Wi-Fi. So the European Commission got it, and they issued this mandate, and it kicked off a study group. So the focus was really the US and Europe, because you had 2 different approaches to making spectrum available. And the European process is very formal. They create a political study group and a technical study group. And it's very collaborative. It was eye-opening for me. It was the first time I'd participated in one of these groups, and it was, I probably logged about 150,000 miles last year alone, just traveling back and forth to Europe for these study group meetings. But you have a chairman, and they bring together all of the various interests. So imagine a room where you have the fixed service, people that are using this spectrum. Most of the time, they're not saying, "Oh, come in. I know there's not going to be harmful interference. We'd love for you to use this spectrum," right? So you have those interests. You have the satellite interests who are using this for uplink and ultra wideband. And then you have 48 countries that each have their own interests, their own national interests, their own national priorities. You put all those folks together in a room, and that's kind of where the magic happens, right? So you set an agenda. It took us a year to develop assumptions. Then we did these technical studies, did a report. That report was approved. Then political discussions happened, and we do another report. But it's all marching towards this European Commission mandate to make 6 gigahertz available for Wi-Fi. So there was this vision, but then what are the technical parameters? Can you prove it's okay? And what are the technical parameters? So we've been working on that for a little over 2 years. I think that European Commission mandate was in 2017, I want to say, towards the tail end, I think right around the December timeframe. And then have been working on that, and then this FCC process. So the focus was these 2 regulatory jurisdictions. Let's get it right, get the ball rolling. And then, other, countries within these jurisdictions, like within Europe, will kick things off. And then, of course, there are other countries like Korea who's already started exploring this, right? But that was the general idea.
So the idea was to have, the FCC and the Europe countries starting the process, allowing unlicensed use on 6 gigahertz, and then you guys are hoping that the rest of the world will follow along?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's the goal.
Yeah, it's a pretty tedious process, but definitely required in order to conduct that level of detail in the analysis. And I had previously, I had a very small stint in doing some license frequency. And I remember I had to fill out the FCC documentation, and there's a lot to fill out there, and they get all those details. So I know which database you're talking about, and that's how you could do some research into seeing what frequencies are in, say, your surrounding area, and which ones could be interfering, for example, when you look at this study. And you mentioned how some of these signals are actually used at like a higher elevation, right? One of the things that comes to mind is when maybe a wireless internet service provider looks at the 6 gigahertz band and goes, wow, I could really use a lot of this frequency. And you had mentioned the use of directional antennas. And sometimes I wonder what's going to happen if you have someone not as knowledgeable, but decides to use the omnidirectional antenna and start broadcasting their signal that could potentially interfere. How did the process go into play when having to work with incumbents in that regard?
It's a really good question, Roel, and it's been an excellent learning opportunity. So we started by conducting this really detailed technical analysis, and I think that was filed about 2.5 years ago, maybe 2018, maybe a little less than 2.5 years ago. I think it was the January timeframe. We started working on all of this publicly available information and defining the radio characteristics of what we thought 6 gigahertz equipment would look like. How often do we think they're going to be on air? What are the primary use cases? How are they going to be used? And then what we did is we actually took over 90,000 fixed links in the continental United States, because there's a lot of these, and we didn't even look at Alaska and Hawaii, but we dropped them. And we hired an engineering firm, RKF Engineering Services, who specializes in technical analyses that you might typically see in the ITU or another body. And we worked with them to develop this engineering study. And that process, just developing the assumptions and, figuring out, directionally, okay, these fixed links are at, like I said, they could be separated by, tens of miles. What are the radio characteristics? And then we had to randomly drop Wi-Fi devices. And so what you do is you drop these Wi-Fi devices with, different assumptions, in terms of their usage, indoor, outdoor, antenna patterns, et cetera. And you look at it, okay, in a truly random environment in the wild, we do nothing else except say, these are the 5 gigahertz rules. We're going to drop them into 6 gigahertz. What happens? And we looked at interference scenarios. What are the geometries where you could have an issue? How would these networks interact? And so there was a lot of study and then, debugging the simulation, and then drawing conclusions on, the most appropriate fit, the most appropriate way to go into the market without creating an issue. And so, you said something that kind of, got me thinking about this whole process. You talked about wireless internet service providers, very important for rural broadband, right? Incredibly important, making sure that we have, good internet connectivity, all over the country and all over the world. But as you mentioned, if you have different types of antennas, they're configured the wrong way, you could create a lot of, interference potential. So we thought back on what had happened in Uni 2C. There are these weather radars. They're called TDWR. And there were issues where people were modifying equipment, putting on different antennas, and they were interfering with radars. Well, ultimately, what ended up happening is the FCC, and other countries had to do this as well, had to take an enforcement action. And what they ended up doing is notching out 50 megahertz of this spectrum, which ended up interrupting our ability to not only use that 50 megahertz, but an 80 megahertz channel, right? So the FCC notched that out. And so we learned, hey, the problem here was that someone could modify equipment. These are connectorized antennas. And the biggest issue here are for Wi-Fi devices that are placed outside, and you could modify the antennas. So we started thinking through what are ways we could constrain this equipment so that it wouldn't interfere with the user experience, but addresses the risk. I can't think of anything worse than deploying services that rely on this new band, and all of a sudden the government says, nope, you've created an issue, right? We wanted to future-proof this. We wanted to dummy-proof it. And so in the process of going through this, we thought, okay, we really need to think about this in terms of classes of equipment and propose mitigations that can be absorbed by those classes. Obviously, if something requires a dedicated listening device and an antenna on your house, the average consumer is not going to use that, right? So that's never going to work. I mean, that's the idea of, a mitigation that was proposed in the middle of the 5 gigahertz band. So we started thinking through all of this, and we thought, okay, well, what if we had something that was constrained to indoor only? we found through our simulations that the risk of harmful interference to an incumbent operation, to a licensed user, was limited if it were constrained. Well, how do we constrain it? So we started thinking creatively. Okay, it's got to be connected to mains power. It's got to be plugged into a wall. Okay, well, people have an extension cord. Keep it from being weatherproofed. Well, someone can weatherproof it after the fact. So we started thinking about what are the common sense things that we could do that could be implemented, but would in totality make it difficult for this to be used for a different purpose. And we came back to this idea of antenna design. What if you had an integrated antenna? If you have an integrated antenna, I can't weatherproof this thing. I can't put it in a box without creating shadowing and all kinds of other problems, sort of interfering with the reception of my signal anyway, right? So if I have integrated antennas, I can't weatherproof it. It's got to be connected to mains power. All of these things in totality reduce the risk of someone using this for the wrong purpose, right? And then the other thing is power, right? If you're looking for broad macro area coverage, you want to keep that power down. So one of the things that we looked at was, hey, rather than approaching Wi-Fi like Wi-Fi has been approached in the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz band. So as you both know, we started out in Wi-Fi with 20 megahertz channels, right? And so, of course, there are all kinds of other unlicensed devices that operate in different frequency bandwidths. But for Wi-Fi, it started at 20 megahertz. And so we optimized our designs based upon a total allowable transmit EIRP. And oftentimes the power spectral density was even beyond what we could drive for maximum power, because there's some devices that are narrower bandwidth than a 20 megahertz channel. So we thought, what are we lacking? What do we need? And what we were lacking are these, spectrum for the 160 and Wi-Fi 7 will have 320 megahertz channels is what's expected. So we needed that. And so we thought, well, what if regulators, what if the FCC regulated this on a power spectral density basis? What this would allow is it would allow us to drive a higher total power over a wider bandwidth, but on a per megahertz basis, I could reduce my interference potential. So for example, the FCC is proposing in the regulation 5 dBm per megahertz, which means that in a 20 megahertz channel, my radiated power is only 18 dBm EIRP. That's 18 dBm less than the 5 gigahertz band. But on a 160 megahertz channel, we're looking at 27 dBm EIRP. And on a 320 megahertz channel, we're looking at 30 dBm EIRP. So by holding that power spectral density static, irrespective of the wideband, it encourages wider bandwidth traffic. You don't get any range as you drop, you cut your bandwidth in half, but also provides that highway that we need for, faster throughput and lower latency traffic. So it was the combination of power and equipment design that reduced the risk of interference to incumbent systems, so we don't find ourselves in the type of situation the industry found itself in years ago in the 5 gig band.
I think power spectral density is going to be one of the most important topics about 6 gigahertz and understanding that when it comes to deployments, because I know a lot of locations just like to transmit the highest power they can, and that's where some people try to get away with less access points than required. So right away, by lowering that transmit power there, I start thinking we might need a little bit more access points in our design. But then I started looking or thinking about my designs, and I actually designed to less than that with the ability to tune it higher. So we may be good there, I think. And then I did hear you mention Wi-Fi 7. Am I correct there?
Yeah.
So we're just getting used to Wi-Fi 6, and you dropped Wi-Fi 7 in there.
Well, people are working on these things years. The engineers and IEEE are working on this years before companies start talking about it. So
like what you said earlier about how this has taken so many years to get to this point. And so now that we're at this point, there's probably another team that's already working on Wi-Fi 7. So that way, once we're all upgraded, we're ready next to jump to the next iteration of Wi-Fi.
Yep, absolutely.
I had another question related to the antennas. So if I understood correctly, are you saying that we will not have the ability to have external antennas in our 6 gigahertz APs?
Well, let's be careful when we say external. I would say, at least, Broadcom's proposal has been no external connectorized antennas. The danger, the harm is something that could be decoupled, and then you could, hey, it was designed for 1.8 dBi dipole, and all of a sudden I'm driving directional gain through that system. So the idea is having integrated. Now, that might all be what you'd see in modern devices where it's within the casing, or it might be configured differently to obtain isolation or something else. But the idea is having something that cannot be removed, and once it's certified, it's sort of tamper resistant and couldn't be easily modified.
Okay, so we could still be using directional antennas. They will just be embedded into the device, pretty much.
Yeah, yep. I mean, ultimately, it's going to be up to the FCC lab to come up with the requirements that are necessary to import and market these devices in the United States. And so, they're going to, provide all of the fine print for the labs to certify against. But that's my expectation. My expectation is that these will be integrated antennas and cannot be removed.
Okay, so going back to the FCC, this month the Chairman Pai announced the draft report and order, and then I think there is a vote on April 23rd. Would you be able to explain what that draft report and order is, and how does it relate to the vote, and where are we in the process of making the 6 gigahertz band full, finally available for unlicensed use?
Sure. So we are, to use a baseball analogy, we're at the bottom of the ninth inning and 2 outs. So the game's almost over. And so the Chairman Pai circulates. He has the habit, or it's been his habit, his process to circulate orders, major report and orders, or major actions, rulemakings, to his colleagues, and he'll announce publicly what that order will be. And he makes it available to the public to comment on, to make sure that all the details are correct, and the relevant bureaus within the FCC, like the Office of Engineering and Technology, clearly understood what industry wanted, what was necessary to protect incumbents, et cetera. So that was circulated. Chairman Pai announced this, historic move on April 1st, and then April 2nd, that draft report and order was circulated. Okay, and that draft report and order was made up of 2 parts. Part 1 are final rules that would enable low power indoor use for Wi-Fi. So when I was talking to you about the antenna constraints and power spectral density limits, the FCC proposed all of this and to make low power indoor available. Then they also authorized another class of equipment, standard power. And this is more typical of what you'd see in the 5 gig or the 2.4 band, indoor or outdoor. But because these devices have a higher risk of interference because they can be everywhere and they're not constrained, it requires coupling with a database called automated frequency coordination. That's what the FCC is calling it. So the FCC provided some baseline rules for that, like, what are the propagation assumptions that you would use? How would you determine whether a channel is available? What are the power levels? So the basic details. And then the FCC is recommending a process for something they call an AFC operator, which would be someone that would manage this database and make the services available. And it's kind of outlining how someone could, become an AFC operator. So, they've outlined all of this stuff, and, people will have to apply, and there'll probably be a further rulemaking and associated with designating these quote unquote AFC operators. So the rule establishes standard power operations and low power indoor operations. Then the other part of the rule is to issue a notice of further proposed rulemaking. And this is a very targeted FNPRM. Okay, and this FNPRM proposes to do two things. One thing is the record, I think, makes it very, very clear that the FCC provided a very conservative power level for indoor low power, 5 dBm per megahertz. And so they established a provision here to enable potentially a little higher power. And so this FNPRM will invite people to comment on whether or not that power level can be increased to 8 dBm per megahertz, so 3 dB higher. And then the other portion of this FNPRM, or this targeted further rulemaking, was to develop a record to enable VLP. VLP is very low power portable devices. So think of Bluetooth, but for highly immersive video experiences, like peer-to-peer. I have a compute device that might be my cell phone or something else connecting to AR/VR glasses. And so very low power, typically body worn, or it could be something that's in an automotive, driverless car, where I'm laying out, Google or Apple Maps on my windshield, identifying what street I'm on, where to turn, where services are. But it's to provide that sort of next generation experience. And so the FCC's issued a proposal there. And that category is super important, I think, to the industry and to the future of connectivity policy. And that was something that wasn't in the original notice of proposed rulemaking. So, Broadcom and many of our partners were very active commenting on that. And I think the FCC wants to establish a little bit better record there in order to set power limits and any technical requirements. So the good news is we're going to have 1,200 megahertz available under Chairman Pai's vision. It's going to kick off low power indoor. There'll be a process to have higher power in outdoor use for the more typical Wi-Fi experience. And we could soon have rules in place that would allow us for really digitally immersive next generation experiences, like glasses that I could be wearing and could couple with access points in an edge cloud, say in a stadium, to have next generation fan experiences, or could couple with my cable modem, and I could watch the next rendition of Star Wars or whatever in an immersive 3D experience. Or when I'm walking about town, I'm no longer buried with my face in my cell phone, but I'm getting diagnostics on my glasses, my Google Maps, etc. So super excited about that opportunity, and look forward to engaging with the FCC to make that available after the NPRM comes out.
Those are a lot of good potential use cases.
Yeah. I was going to say, do we have to wait for everything to be approved, or will we be able to start choosing the indoor use cases before everything gets approved by the FCC?
So nothing can be used and nothing can be released until it's approved, right?
Okay.
And so if you think about it, the low power indoor will be approved, and then of course client devices or user equipment could be approved. But if you want someone to always wear that equipment outside, you have to make it useful. It's kind of like wearable technology. If it only works in certain locations, I put it on the desk, I forget about it. So our view is, if you can allow portable backhaul, like through a cell phone, like we're requesting in this VLP class, this becomes another thing that I wear wherever I'm located. I'm not wearing a scuba mask on my face, but I've got something that I might buy, from LensCrafters, say, that accentuates my personal style, right? I don't have to have phased array antennas on my head or look like Mork and Mindy with, the good old fashioned bunny ears in order to get receptivity. So we think that once VLP is enabled, this will drive a wearable use case. But you could see people that start providing things and implementing based upon low power indoor access points, that's certainly going to be the workhorse. But we think the mobile category is very important to drive the market.
Okay. And you guys at Broadcom already have some chipsets available, right? So we could potentially see some devices coming out on the market as soon as everything gets approved, correct?
That's correct, Francois. So Broadcom in our access point division announced 8 access point chips. I think it was right around CES of this year. And, these chips are sampling. And then we announced a Hero class device for user equipment for cell phones. And we provided a demo of this capability when we launched. And then we worked with our friends at Intel, and we demoed this for the FCC. We got an experimental license because this isn't yet available for over-the-air use. So we obtained an experimental license, and we actually showed the FCC what would happen. A lot of times they take these steps in faith in the hopes that industry will invest. And we wanted to show them that this was the biggest thing. This was so exciting that the gate, we have the fans are in the stand. The tickets have been sold. The game's ready to start. We just need the referee to blow the whistle. And so we showed a Broadcom chip connecting to an Intel chip before the certification program's finished, before the standard's completely finished. We did over the air on our prototype devices, and we were driving over 1.8 gigabits per second between our two devices. And those were prototypes. By the time you get to final software, when we had done over-the-air testing with Broadcom chips, we were over at 2.2 gigabits per second. So super exciting, less than 2 milliseconds round trip latency. So,
wow.
Once again, imagine what you can build on if you're an application provider with that sort of tech.
And that's using Wi-Fi 6?
Wi-Fi 6E.
6E, so, yeah, right.
Yeah.
One thing I actually wanted to talk about, I guess it's related to Wi-Fi 6E is, when they will release 6 gigahertz for unlicensed use, it's not just going to be for Wi-Fi use, right? It's also going to be used by 5G maybe, right? Can you talk about that a little bit and how it could, how we're going to have to work with the cellular industry as well to make sure that we're not stepping on each other.
Yeah, this frequency is not just for Wi-Fi, even though everyone keeps talking about it for Wi-Fi. Just reading FCC's announcements, they always talk about it being for that it's unlicensed, but with the innovations being in the Wi-Fi space.
Yeah, I think the technology that most Americans are familiar with, and it's easy to wrap your arms around, is Wi-Fi, right? It's the dominant wireless technology, but you're absolutely correct. Any technology that is designed to be used on unlicensed spectrum and complies with the rules can be used. And so 3GPP is standardizing 5G new radio specifically for unlicensed, and they were targeting the 5 gigahertz band, which is already available, and then the 6 gigahertz band should it become available. And I would expect that, other technologies might also take a look and see if they can design their products in a manner that's consistent with the regulatory requirements and can provide a valuable user experience. So sure. But if I think about market readiness and I think about, Wi-Fi attach rates, and if I think about sort of the scale of Wi-Fi, I think, far and away, my prognostication here is that that will be the dominant unlicensed technology in the 6 gigahertz band. The expectation is then that if there are issues, they would be worked out in the various standards groups. So, I would expect to see a Wi-Fi Alliance or IEEE working with 3GPP. In Europe, there you have the ETSI standards process, which once again, I said Europe tends to be a little bit more prescriptive. So it will lay out the specific designs that are required and coexistence mechanisms that are required. And so you'll have that process as the spectrum becomes available in Europe. And so there'll be plenty of opportunities for manufacturers and radio designers of both types of devices to work together to ensure that there's a good user experience and that it doesn't create issues for licensed users in the band.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how everything will play around. I think in the indoor space, I think Wi-Fi will still stay the main technology to connect to the network. But I'm guessing maybe for outdoor networks, maybe, on the campus, you could have outdoor networks run by cellular 5G, let's say, and then indoor run by Wi-Fi, everything connected to the same type of backhaul network. Maybe we'll see something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there'll be opportunities for that. I've been tracking small cells and have been looking at Wi-Fi and unlicensed 3GPP technologies such as LAA and others for a long time now. And one of the things that I've noted is there are forecasts for small cells. Hey, this is what we're going to have in 2017, 2018, 2019. And what I find is that each year the numbers are revised downward. And it's very challenging. Not that it can't happen, and I think you'll see it, but you're talking about very small cell networks based upon the power, and then coming up with a structure that incentivizes business owners, lessees, right, property owners to allow this equipment to be deployed. Is it neutral host? How do you share when you have all these carriers? What's the benefit to a business owner with a Wi-Fi? They can get diagnostics from SSIDs or whatever. They can log in, get free Wi-Fi, and then can get information and advertise. So there's a whole model when you talk about provisioning Wi-Fi that gives an owner, operator, or whomever some measure of control and benefit. And so that's a pretty well-established market, and it drives a very high availability, and the equipment is very reasonable in terms of cost and configuring. So, it's a fantastic head start from the Wi-Fi community, and lots of business models have been designed around that. But no one should rest on their laurels, and certainly new technologies are going to come out, and competition is all good. But I like Wi-Fi's position where they are right now in terms of taking advantage of this fantastic opportunity that we hope to have before us after the 23rd.
Yeah, I agree. I do want to touch upon AFC for just a minute or two, if you have the background to it as we come to an end on this episode. AFC is going to be new to a lot of people. The can't remember the acronym, Automated Frequency Control. Coordination. And is that borrowed from CBRS?
No, but that's a fantastic question, right? So it's very similar, right? If you want to talk about any sort of database, and there's been various models, but what really popularized database for unlicensed use was for the TV white spaces, right? So back in the day when we were moving from broadcast video to digital, from analog to digital, and this whole repacking and this opportunity to make available beachfront spectrum, really wide coverage, those TV white spaces auctions, and there were specific areas that the commission designated for potential unlicensed use, and so using that spectrum required a database. And so there were rules there. The UK Ofcom has some rules, and there are other countries around the world that have explored using these TV white spaces for connectivity. Sort of and that was fit for purpose to protect the broadcasters that were there or other users. And then Gen 2 would be the CBRS. And in this instance, you came up with this, shared licensed access and having priority users and, general access license holders and a centralized database regime. And that's sort of at the forefront of everyone's mind because there's been a lot of talk about that over the last couple of years as as the commission has sought to finalize those rules. And has made announcements on certain database operators. So this is similar insofar as an automated frequency coordination knows where the incumbent is and what the frequencies are, and then provides you with a diagnostic and analysis to determine whether or not you can use a channel and at what power level you could use that channel without creating harmful interference. So it's still a database, it's still using frequency coordination, but it is way scaled down from what was designed for CBRS, where, you've got these, top secret licenses, national security, you have no idea where they are, signal characteristics. Some users have priority over other users. So it's a very complex regime. This is very, very simple. The users that are being protected are well known. They're citing, where they're pointed, all of the information is publicly available. They're constantly transmitting. And so this will be nowhere near as dynamic. It'll be very, very simple and very static. So people that have kind of seen the CBRS rules and seen the TV white space rules and kind of shuddered at the complexity involved in deploying equipment and ensuring a decent user experience, shouldn't jump to conclusions on AFC. If this is done right, the way that Broadcom and others have requested, and the way the FCC has envisioned, the chairman has envisioned, this should be something that is fairly simple to roll out and effectuate. There's a lot of detail that'll go into this, so it's not going to be overnight. It's probably not going to be this year, but it's something that we could see in the next few years.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. I think it was very good episode. A lot of valuable information from you. Thank you very much for spending the time and talking about the whole process with us. I guess the last question I have for you is, what's going to be next for you after 6 gigahertz?
Well,
it's been your baby for like 5 years.
Yeah, for over 4 years. Yeah, well, I still got other markets, and we've got AFC and this VLP, but I'm excited to see how the industry standardizes, things for audio, visual, AR, VR, and so I think that there'll be a lot of work there over the coming years.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Very exciting stuff.
Yeah, and I guess we wish you the best of luck to finish the whole process. It sounds like it's not quite done yet. Wish you all the luck for that. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for coming on. And then we'll share all the details on the website. This is probably going to be episode 217. So if you head up to cleartosend.net/217, you'll be able to get some more details about what we talked about today. Thank you, guys.
Sounds
Have
fantastic.
a good week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Bye-bye.